Pretty much everything in this animation was made by one person. Over about 3 years, I came up with the style, story, characters, sets, animation, sound, music, and pretty much everything else besides the voice acting and a couple other little things that we'll get to. I'm Fall On Creature, and this is behind the scenes for Legend of the Janitor Part 1. So a few years ago, I made a LEGO animation called SCP the Janitor, which was based on an obscure SCP short story. Since then, I've always wanted to do something more with this character. Also, after making LEGO animations for over a decade, I wanted to try something new. I was inspired by other animated web series on YouTube, like Umami's Interface series and SCP Confinement, rest in peace. Developing this new style took about 3 years. So in coming up with a new animation style, I had 3 key goals. Firstly, I wanted something that was simple to make and fast to render, so it could be made by one person. Second, I wanted a unique, iconic style that you could recognize at a glance. And finally, I wanted a style that could work with dramatic narrative and support the type of stories that I wanted to tell. A few years ago, I came across screenshots of a PlayStation 1 era game called Mega Man Legends. This game has a really appealing lo-fi style, low poly models, great colors, and charming pixel art. I realized that this style would meet most of my goals. It would be really fast to render due to the low resolution, it was a unique and interesting style, and also the anime influence lent it some dramatic possibilities. I learned Blender to make this animation and spent many hours delving into tutorials and doing lots of little tests. One great resource that I found was a website of Mega Man Legends models that I could download, import into Blender, and then pull apart to see how they were made. I failed a lot during this stage and tried a lot of different things. For example, at one point I tried animating the janitor using motion capture from an Xbox Kinect system. I spent about 2 years doing this process of learning and refining and getting closer to the style that I wanted. When I did this bit of test footage, I knew I was getting somewhere, but then more than one person pointed out that it looked kinda like Roblox. So I redid the janitor model and then did this test footage for the elevator scene. With this bit of footage, I knew that I could finally pull it off, so I started making the rest of the animation. I won't talk too much about the story right now because we're still in the early stages of it, but if you want to know where the canon sits, the LEGO animation technically happens before this one. For this episode, I went with a flashback style narrative, which allowed me to pack a lot more information into a tighter runtime. I wrote a script and kept it blue tacked to the walls around my desk while I was working. I also color-coded each of the scenes to make it easier to navigate. When it came to designing the characters, it was a bit of a process. I settled on a more boxy style of character modeling because I found it was easier to make. I don't really have a lot of drawing skills either, so I couldn't really do the anime eyes very well, so I ended up doing more Tintin or Adventure Time style faces with dots for eyes. That way the faces would be expressive but also simple to make. The big tentacle monster is not actually based on any particular SCP. It's actually inspired by a monster of the week from an old TV show called Space 1999. In the episode called Dragon's Domain, there's a monster with a big white glowing eye and lots of tentacles. If you get too close, it'll hypnotize you, suck you in, deep fry you, and then spit out your charred corpse. And of course this absolutely terrified me as a kid. I didn't do storyboards for the entire animation, but I did do these little chicken scratch drawings for the more intense action scenes. One big thing that I tried to keep in mind for most of the fight was to make sure that the janitor always faced right to left and that the monster always faced left to right. For the rooftop scene, I didn't do any storyboards. Instead, I just roughly animated the scene and then found the camera angles as the conversation went along. I figured that approaching it this way, I could find camera angles and focal lengths that I wouldn't have thought of otherwise. The lighting in each of the scenes is made up of mostly a single color. The rooftop is blue, the control room is green, and the janitor fight is red, and then also the hallway is yellow. Because the story cuts between all of these different places, I figured it would make it easier to tell where we were at any given time. I rendered the entire animation in a big square format so that I could cut it down to a 2:1 aspect ratio for YouTube, and then also do a portrait style 16:9 for stuff like TikTok and Instagram Reels. One interesting side effect of this is that I now have an open matte sort of IMAX version of the animation, so if you want to check that out, it's on my Patreon. This whole animation is at 15 frames per second, which is a common frame rate for LEGO animation. It's also the frame rate that Umami uses for the Interface series. I'd occasionally drop into animating on 2s, which means that I only move the character every second frame, so effectively 7.5 frames per second. This gives the animation a more crispy staccato feel that I'd associate with anime or the Spider-Verse movies. The action scenes took a long time to animate. There were some shots less than 10 seconds long that took 2 to 3 days to make. I'd usually start by blocking out the key poses and the camera movement first, and then just go in and keep adding more poses until it looked good. Sometimes I would use really specific references for certain poses. For example, this pose was inspired by Spider-Man, and this pose was inspired by My Hero Academia. Just as a side note, this pose was super difficult to get right, and I'm still not totally happy with it. I iterated on it so many times that I just had to call it done and then move on. Animating the dialogue scenes was a lot easier than the action scenes. I realized that in a lot of shots I could get away with just animating the arms and the heads of the characters, and for the most part it worked great. The eyes for the monster were just spheres with one side white and the other side black. I just rotated them to make it look like they were opening. For shots like this, I created a puddle by flipping the footage, adding a ripple distortion, and then a mosaic effect to make it more pixelated. For the dust and smoke effects, I started off thinking that I could do them all by myself, so I animated this one by hand in Adobe Animate. It looked okay, but I wasn't very good at it and it took ages to do. So I figured this was something that I could probably just use stock elements for. So for most of the dust, smoke, and electricity effects, I sourced them from a stock video website. This saved me a whole bunch of time. The explosion effect was just a lot of layers. I used the same stock dust and smoke elements that I used in other parts of the video. I just stacked a whole bunch of these on top of each other, layer by layer, until I had a big explosion. The little rotating shine before the explosion is directly inspired by the anime Evangelion. The angels, as they fight, often do this cool star flash effect before they blow the shit out of something. The power-up effect was made of a few things. I started by lighting the janitor with a bunch of white rim light. I then created some distortion layers that I split into red, green, and blue. I then added a couple of white flickering circles behind him, and then some stock assets of cartoon flames to complete the effect. I think I was going for a very Super Saiyan kind of vibe with this. I used sound effects from a lot of places. There were sounds in here from freesound.org and sound libraries that I've accumulated over the years, as well as sounds that I recorded on the fly. To give you an idea for the amount of work that goes into the sound design, here are just a few of the layers that I use for the tentacle sounds. So in here we've got a bike tire on gravel, the sound of striking some metal cables, a balloon being rubbed, this weird sound of a slinky being pulled apart, and I think this is just a slowed down recording of me sucking in some air. For the rooftop scene, I tried to make the rain noise change based on where the camera was. So if the camera was out in the open, it would have a more open sound. And if we were undercover, we'd be able to hear the rain hitting the roof above. The aim was to create a sort of subtle, immersive effect. I made all of the music by myself in Reason using some free drum samples that I found, as well as some free VSTs like Spitfire Audio and Project Sam. I'm really not much of a musician, so I just messed around a bunch and kept iterating until it didn't sound terrible. I just didn't really want to use stock music. Here's some other random stuff that's in the animation. I used the FitnessGram Pacer Test copy pasta for all of the text in the control room. I initially just put it in as a placeholder, but nobody that I showed it to said anything about it, so I just left it in the final animation. All of the levels in this blueprint animation are just based on a shopping center in my city, so based on that, I think technically the janitor is just going into Kmart or something. In the open matte version of this animation, I accidentally got a boom mic in shot, but it was going to get cropped out anyway, so I left it in there. I'd like to shout out my voice actors, Alex and Storm the Blank, who also does LEGO animation. and James from Fall on Foundry, who cameoed as this guy in the background. There's also a hidden QR code somewhere in the video that I don't think anyone's found yet. Nope, scratch that, reverse it, somebody found it while I was editing this video. So that's just kind of a broad overview, but if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. If you want to see more of these animations sooner, the best way to do that is to support me on Patreon. And that's about it, so thanks for watching.